Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for PAVE's 90th virtual panel. Our topic today is digital infrastructure and highly automated driving, and we have a special format today. Dr. Dan McGehee, who is the director of the National Advanced Driving Simulator at the University of Iowa, is going to give us a presentation on the fascinating topic of digital infrastructure, and then we'll ask some audience questions at the end. So I will turn it over to Dr. McGehee. Thank you so much for joining us and look forward to the presentation.
All right, thanks very much, Tara, and the rest of the great PAVE team that's been doing such a fabulous job. I can't believe it's been 90 presentations now. It seems like yesterday we just started this. So I'm going to share my screen here real quick, and hopefully this will be seamless. So let me know when you see the whole screen there.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So I started off our presentation today. I'm just going to go through a few slides to really talk about the conceptual aspects of the digital infrastructure of the future. And a painting that is on my wall in my office here at the National Advanced Driving Simulator is one called Death on the Ridge Road. And that's what is seen here. And this was done by the Iowa painter Grant Wood. The Ridge Road is about 30 miles from here. And this is one that particularly inspires me in the work that we do in roadway safety, vehicle safety, transportation safety writ large. In 1934, Grant Wood's best friend was killed in a car crash on this road. And he painted this scene of the roadway system, which was largely gravel and a little bit of pavement. And so he sort of portrays this gloom and doom with the storm on the horizon, the crucifix telephone poles, the careering vehicles about to crash. And this is one I've actually had my engineering students study to try to reconstruct the speeds. Now, the infrastructure back in the mid-1930s was fairly crude compared to our standards today, especially in the rural areas. They were essentially dirt. And many of those crashes were fatal because of the design of the vehicles and the roadways and so forth. But if we fast forward to today, at the National Advanced Driving Simulator, we have here an $80 million driving simulator that we conduct research that integrates many of the automated driving systems of today. We tend to work about 30 years ahead of production. In fact, ADAS systems here that are in production today came through our simulation labs just about 30 years ago, 25 to 30 years ago, we were doing ADAS work. And then real briefly, we're using many different vehicles on the road today that integrate digital infrastructure that I'll be talking about today. And most recently, the ADS for Rural America project. If you go to adsforruralamerica.com, you'll see that project. And what's listed here on the screen is a special transit vehicle that we're picking up riders, specially recruited riders, on a 47-mile rural route that many parts of it don't have paint in the road or other markings to give traditional automated driving systems awareness of where they are on the road. And I'll be talking about that. The next slide, I'm really going to talk about the layers of infrastructure in the past, present, and future, and how those will be integrated. And so today we have sort of a base infrastructure of roads and bridges that we ride on top of. And so you can imagine a vehicle being on top of that. And then on top of that layer of the roadway, we have road users, cars, pedestrians, bicycles that ride on top of that physical layer. And then on top of that, we have what I love to call roadway furniture, which is the common term that civil engineers and roadway designers use. And that is the signs, the guardrails, the markings, and so forth in the roadway. And then we have traffic management that sits on top of that, yet again, that controls the flow of traffic, whether it's a traffic signal or other information that helps traffic flow. And on top of that, today, modern infrastructure includes yet another integrator, and that is the cloud. And what's interesting about the cloud is that we go from the physical world of the roadway, pedestrian vehicles, roadway furniture, traffic lights, from that physical infrastructure into the informational infrastructure where these data are today integrated and then communicated with the broader traffic management system. So for highly automated vehicles or highly automated driving systems, our terms, as you all know, are changing almost every day. We are going to integrate those things into a number of strategies and digital technologies to make the next generation work. And so from here, we start sensing from the inside of the vehicle out. And those, the base infrastructure will be 3D mapped. And we use LiDAR systems. So LiDAR, for a quick review, is sort of a stack of lasers that are scanning the world out there. And what we do with that is we begin to integrate the inside out information from the vehicle, so radar, LiDAR, computer vision systems, and so forth, with the outside in sensing world out there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But the important part of some of the integration of the next generation of infrastructure is really integrating behavioral models of road users and their behavior, because we need to understand from the digital infrastructure side of things, really that social interaction is a two-way street. It's sort of a back and forth strategy that's going on, where human drivers react or don't react to other human drivers or automated driving systems of the future. And different strategies for intelligence systems need to be able to respond and, more importantly, predict how human drivers are doing in the world. So there's a lot of strategy that goes into the decision-making sciences out there that integrates the human behavioral side with the next generation of digital infrastructure. Again, information integration is really the key. So when you start to then look at that information in more detail, the vehicle is looking out with computer vision systems, for instance, vehicle to vehicle communication, vehicle to infrastructure communication is best to really help these different vehicles communicate back and forth. So the traffic signal heads are communicating via their own physical lamps, lights that change, but also can send a cellular signal or even a network signal to the vehicle for safety and security to make sure that that vehicle is getting the right lamp state. Because the signal state is critical, because if the vehicle gets that wrong, that outcome can be very catastrophic in terms of a car going through a red light. And this becomes important in terms of this redundancy, because cameras, computer vision systems, get blinded in the morning and the afternoon, just like we humans do. And so one of those signals may be less reliable based on the time of day. So cellular communication or network communication, a redundant signal of some kind will be required to really accurately make sure that you can go through that intersection. I think first generation systems that are looking at just camera-based solutions will actually, when there's uncertainty because of glare from the sun, will essentially just turn off and turn it back over to the driver. And that could even be at night when there's oncoming light glare and so forth. But the point here is really that redundancy will be required in the long range future for these systems to be reliable and safe. So that vehicle then will begin to communicate with other vehicles around it to get that signal timing and so forth. And then the next generation, as I mentioned before, we're going to integrate the cloud communication side of things into this broader communication infrastructure, because the integrator in the cloud is really the one that's going to be tracking vehicles, much like traffic management systems right now rely on loop detectors and other systems out there to understand the flow of traffic. We'll be able to do that in much more detail as we track individual vehicles, not Susie Smith or Joey Smith's car, but a vehicle that's traveling on a particular speed at a particular street, and the time to collision around it, around other vehicles and so forth, can be better managed from there. And so that really becomes sort of that V to X, that vehicle to everything mode that goes into the cloud. Now, the most important element today that we are integrating is high definition mapping. And that's really key to the successful implementation of highly automated vehicles, because traditional GPS, as you have on your phone or in your vehicle, is only good to about plus or minus 1 meter. So it's important to say plus or minus, which means that you have to double that size. So if you use that as part of your control system for the vehicle, that means your vehicle can be sort of deviating around almost 7 feet back and forth. So that's not very accurate. High definition mapping, which takes a whole bunch of other components into creating a map, gets us down into around plus or minus 7 centimeters, which then can be used as part of the vehicle control and doesn't necessarily need to rely on the paint in the roadway, the center line, skip lines, the shoulder line, fog line, and so forth, that's being used today in production vehicles for lane keeping systems, for instance, and other more highly automated systems rely on paint. But here in Iowa, we're largely a rural state. We don't have paint on all of our rural roads, and certainly we don't have paint on gravel roads. And so high definition mapping is a key control component for us to know where we are in the roadway. And the ADS for Rural America program, if you just Google that, you'll be able to find information about that program, where we are able to get out into the community and pick up people that are going to the doctor or to grocery shopping that may not have transportation. So public transportation in rural North America just doesn't exist. And so these kinds of automated transportation systems in the future, I think, are going to be really key to implementing successful and safe systems. Now, when we start to integrate all this stuff, and since we are a simulator at heart and also do a lot of on-road work, in fact, we're probably doing more on-road work now than we are on the NADS, we're able to model what some of these systems look like when you have sort of complete integration and communication between systems. And so if you can imagine really the long-range future, say 100 years from now, 150 years from now, we don't really need stoplights anymore. And so we can control the speeds of all the vehicles that will essentially go through these intersections unimpeded. So the traffic will never really stop anymore, because we'll be able to control the speeds of these vehicles. So you might think, well, that's got to look pretty crazy. So we took that on our mini simulator here, and we can see from the inside out what this same roadway looks like going through this complicated intersection. And I think depending on how big your screen is, certainly if you're in a fully immersive simulator, this looks a lot more scary to us who are not used to this kind of thing. We'll go one more cycle here and we'll wrap up and get to your questions here for this panel. So in summary, we have a lot of challenges left in automated driving, from policy changes that tend to policy implementation that tends to lag behind technology and innovation, how that's all put together in updating that infrastructure. And certainly the new highway infrastructure bill that's now starting to release projects is going to be addressing digital infrastructure that's not roads and bridges anymore. And we hear a lot about our ailing road and bridge system in the US. But it's really adding that extra digital layer to all of this that's going to be key. And one area to perhaps start is to look at our freight system on the interstate system. Whether it's Interstate 5 on the West Coast or Interstate 80 that goes east-west through the middle of the country, Interstate 35 that runs north-south, creating the Eisenhower freeway system of the 1950s into a Eisenhower 2.0, if you will, that would create a high-definition mapping system that would be publicly available on the major freight routes would be a great start. And one of the really good things about high definition mapping is once you just really need to get a passcode to that, if the public, if the US DOT or state DOTs were to create a sustainable high definition map. And when I say sustainable, high definition maps need to be continually modified because of construction and other roadway changes that occur. So it's a big commitment for infrastructure to maintain that. So it's not like just paving a road and it's done for 5 years, 10 years, or 50 years, depending on how you maintain a roadway. It's something that will be a different kind of spending that we're going to have to do. So the layered approach to really understanding how we communicate within the next generation is one way to sort of conceptualize how this is all put together. And what's really fun being on the faculty in industrial and systems engineering and get to work with human factors students and many different disciplines, data science and so forth, it's all about data. So those of you that are looking at different parts of your career or mentoring students in the future, data science is going to be a really critical element of the future of driving and how we integrate all of this information so that we can effectively and equitably implement automated driving systems in the future. So I'm happy to take questions now. If you want to reach out, send me an email to dmcgehee@uiowa or follow me on Twitter @DanCrashman. I would love to hear from you. If you're ever in the Midwest, please let us know. We'd love to talk to you all and show off all of our stuff. So I'm going to stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Jen. That's a fascinating presentation. And we got some really great questions from the audience as they registered, so wanted to run some of these questions by you. One question someone was pointing out, there obviously are already AVs on the road doing pilots and demonstrations, even some deployments. And so, similar to your layered approach that you were discussing, this person asks, which comes first, the digital infrastructure, the regulatory environment, or the AV? Do you have a comment on that?
I think that's a great question. It's really all of the above. And so when I talk about high definition maps, currently those maps exist, but they are owned by AV operators. So they will contract to have those maps done, and they don't give access to those maps. So it's not like a radio signal that's put out. It's actually it can be a proprietary map. And so they have to be sort of done together. So the automated vehicle needs that kind of digital infrastructure to see the world. What's lagging, as I mentioned before, is the policy. And it really we're talking about 50 different countries in the United States because they all regulate their roadways differently. So the vehicle in itself is regulated by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, but then the roadway systems are, and the operation of the vehicle is regulated by the state. And there's some overlap between those. It's somewhat of a complicated net and web of how these are all put together. But the biggest one that I think states are struggling with are how we let and regulate and understand what is safe and what is not safe. And I think the industry writ large, depending how big the company is, large companies have the resources to spend a lot of resources on safety systems and very sophisticated safety, but you have really small startups that don't really have those resources or the forethought to really think about how things can go wrong. And so, as you've all seen, it takes a very minor incident to become worldwide news. And that's going to be a big challenge in the future when we have more and more crashes and, heaven forbid, fatalities and injuries out there.
Absolutely. And we got two questions that both ask about kind of the business model. They say, as communities prepare for CAVs, are there clear areas of digital infrastructure that the government is responsible for providing and where private investment should provide? And then similarly, another viewer asked, what will be the business model for building and maintaining the digital infrastructure? Will it be a government project? And then who's establishing the standards? Wondered if you could address that too.
Yeah, so I think the first generation of systems, the manufacturers, the makers of ride sharing systems, if you look at Waymo One, for instance, it's now operating in a minor production in Tempe. A number of our colleagues here that may or may not be on the call today had the opportunity to just freely take that vehicle. Waymo, they run their own digital mapping systems. I see that industry will have to, or at least in the short run, provide the mapping infrastructure and databases for their systems to work. I think in the long range future, I think the Federal Highway Administration should entertain making these kinds of digital mapping systems public, much like the roadways are, or figure out some modest way to charge for especially freight systems that are going across, so that there aren't blank spots or you don't rely on one company or another, that that freight can be taken down into rural Mississippi or into downtown Chicago. So I think the long range Federal Highway is planning for those kinds of eventualities and are studying those kinds of things. What was the second question on the business model again?
Who's establishing the standards?
Right now, it's really the industry. It's sort of every man for himself right now. This is a slightly different culture than what you see in the history of automotive safety, where there's quite a bit of communication between OEMs from different SAE panels and so forth. But it's much more independently thought out by different manufacturers and companies that are developing these systems. So I think there's some greater challenges with safety, especially during these pilot testing times, which I think are very critical, that we mind safety. Everybody will say safety is number one, but you really have to think through the implications of how these systems work and under what conditions, and really understand where the limits are of your system. Manufacturers today, for instance, some industries are trying to limit the number of LiDAR systems, which are very expensive, and move more to purely computer vision-based solutions, so thereby creating blind spots. So there's the computer vision industry is taking off like crazy, is getting much better, but it still requires a pretty substantial LiDAR component for fully independent driving.
And then another person actually asked live today, is there a consensus on a specific standard for HD mapping? You touched on that. Sounds like there's not a clear consensus.
Well, it's not like a radio frequency. So let's say sort of dedicated short range communication. Those are made by different manufacturers. Some of those DSRC units that are put on traffic signals, for instance, if you buy a particular manufacturer, you have to, it will only work with a receiver from that company. So HD maps can be made so that they are uh, accessible, but today it's not like you can just turn on your phone and jump onto an HD map. It's a fairly complicated integration.
Right. We also get a lot of public sector viewers. And one question we got is, what should highway operators invest in now to accelerate and maximize the benefits to AVs in the future? Do you have recommendations on that front?
Yeah, some states like Iowa several years ago actually invested in, Iowa DOT invested and used a company called Here, which is one of the largest mapping companies in the world, to actually create a 3,200 lane mile network of HD maps in the states to attract AV companies, so they would give them access to that HD mapping network. I think states should, if they really want to encourage people to come out and test, that would be one way to expand their reach and attract people. But I think the reality is today, the companies that are doing this mostly are large enough to be able to select the regions, the cities, the areas, whether it's in Silicon Valley or Arizona, downtown San Francisco. They are selecting those areas for their own logistics, but that's going to start to expand. And so, as they say, the knee bone connected to thigh bone. If you can connect to another one of their networks, say, and get one of those companies to expand their network, that's going to be attractive to them.
Great. And you've touched on this one as well, but just kind of, it's a different way to ask it. Someone pointed out that there are large differences in the physical infrastructure in the North and the South and urban and rural, and asked if digital infrastructure will have the same kinds of challenges for system developers.
Yeah, I mean, what we're finding already in rural areas, say gravel roads, right? Gravel roads don't have that much traffic. And the people, when you drive, all of our viewers today drive on our gravel road, you tend to sort of drive down the middle of the road because there's not really a lot of people there. Well, a digital map divides that gravel road in half, but the right side of the road is less maintained. So all of a sudden you have your automated vehicle driving on a really soft side of the shoulder it's not used to driving on. And so we normally would avoid that altogether. So gravel roads in particular are going to have to be maintained to a full lane width all the way to the edge, which there are tens of thousands, hundred thousands of miles of those gravel roads. And to get those up to a standard where you could operate safely will be one of the challenges out there, because you just can't do that for all of the roads in the US or North America. But at the same time, driving systems are going to get more intelligent in how to deal with those kinds of things, be able to see much further downrange, understand who's ahead when that vehicle-to-vehicle technology and more long-range sensing becomes a reality.
And if we can sneak in one last question, that was perfect for someone else wrote in live. How will the ever-changing road surfaces of gravel roads be understood by ADS?
Well, I mean, I think that's one thing about intelligent systems, is that essentially every vehicle will sense every drive and understand where there might be a new pothole emerging, a soft spot, a place that might be a washout, after a storm. So they are sensors themselves that are communicating with others, and others can be the county road network administrator, county engineer, the city engineer. So these systems are not just passively operating, they're actively communicating with the other digital infrastructure. So the so-called V2X, the V to everything. So there is a two-way communication going on. So that's going to be an advantage of when they're actually going to recognize when there's a repeatable issue in a roadway.
We are very sadly out of time, and this is just such a fascinating topic that wish we could spend more time on. But thank you so much, Professor McGehee, for your time today. Thank you to the audience. This presentation will be available on our YouTube channel, on our website, pavecampaign.org, and on our podcast, the PAVEcast. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all.